I've been using this thoughts on format as a way to express my analysis of current events as well as opinions on trends or other miscellaneous ideas that pop into my head. This is probably never going to be a consistent thing. It's more when there's something I feel that I have a unique insight or angle on, or just feel passionately enough about to make meaningful comments on, rather than just talking about a recent topic for the sake of talking about it. I'm a little bit late here on the first two topics, but there's just so much interesting news lately, and I had to get my thoughts out, so here they are. Grand Theft Auto 6 is unquestionably the most anticipated video game of all time, with a rumored budget in excess of $1 billion and a development period so legendarily long that it has entered the mainstream cultural lexicon. And if the insane amount of views on this reveal trailer are anything to go by, this is probably going to end up being the biggest video game of all time as well. First, we have to talk about the way the game looks and the more technical side of things, which is honestly a huge surprise if you ask me, even after seeing the leaks last year. It looks really, really good, artistically and technically, in a way that I was just not expecting. GTA 5, while gorgeous in its own right, went for a stylized, cartoonish look, and while Red Dead 2 was much more true to life, its character models have not aged particularly well. I would describe GTA 6's look as hyper-reality. Everything is extraordinarily detailed and many things are portrayed realistically in a way that is extremely noticeable, yet the presentation is still slightly stylized and not uncanny. The character models are absolutely insane, with physically simulated hair bouncing all over the place and tons of different physiques that are all animated differently. There are so many close-up shots here where the characters look so good. I like this shot in particular with the gold grills, the chains and shirt moving, as well as this shot that shows off how the wind realistically blows hair around. I'll talk about where I think these shots were pulled from and how quote-unquote real I believe them to be in a moment, but even the characters in the background, which are 100% random NPCs, have a shocking amount of detail and variety in them. But just as important in a GTA game are the cars, which are almost NPCs and characters in their own right, occupying just as much screen time. I did notice one or two cars that appeared to be very similar to their GTA 5 counterparts, perhaps they're just placeholders for now, but outside of that, every car shown here is extremely well modeled. I would say two are honestly even beyond the standards of a dedicated racing game, with the caveat of these obviously being knockoff designs and still carrying a little bit of stylization to them. The 992 911 Cabriolet, C8 Corvette, and maybe even an M4 GTS, very obscure pick, make appearances here, all looking so close to their source material that it's hard to even call them knockoffs. But what really impressed me was the customization present in what are assuredly NPC vehicles. There's lowriders, cambered out cars, custom painted cars with extremely good looking metallic flake paint, and many of the cars had custom decals and bumper stickers. I don't think there's ever been a game that's had a focus on diversity in NPC vehicles, but that's how real life is. Not everyone is driving around a clean factory car. People have modded Civics, people have bumper stickers, so I think it'll do a lot for the immersion factor of the open world. I was hoping for them to choose a more off-kilter location in the US that's never been in a GTA game, but this rendition of Vice City is gorgeous. Plenty of recognizable locations in the trailer, but if the leaked maps are anything to go by, they're actually attempting to incorporate the entire state of Florida, compressing it down to its most famous locales like Tampa, Fort Myers, Orlando, and even the Florida Keys. This is, without a doubt, going to be the most ambitious open world ever, not just in its size, but in its detail and density, and I assume they're going to push simulation and world interaction further as well. It's all so impressive that I've seen some people be skeptical of it and suggest that this trailer is some sort of pre-rendered trickery. I don't think that's the case. There's nothing here that seems all that unbelievable to me technically, and Rockstar has a track record of not making false promises with their trailers for at least the last 4 games. And I doubt they'd start doing it now with what is literally the most anticipated game of all time. The trailer has 3 types of shots in it: panning shots of the open world, scenes from in-world social media and news, and then shots which are either cut from cutscenes or were made specifically for this trailer. I think it's those more curated scenes that tend to look the most impressive, but most scripted cutscenes in AAA games do look really good now. I don't have any reason to be skeptical of it. This is confirmed to be a PS5 and Xbox Series game. It's 100% going to be 30 FPS on those consoles, and it appears to be using ray-traced global illumination and maybe partial RT reflections blended with screen space reflections. That should be perfectly achievable, none of that is new for games. Rockstar has always been more about manpower and resources than it has been about raw tech, and I think that's on display here, making this trailer look so impressive. And it's being misconstrued as some kind of technical black magic by some. From everything I hear about modern game development, the limitations aren't really tech anymore, it's resources and time, and this is what's possible when resources and time are virtually unlimited. There's no hardware limitation preventing developers from making 500 different well-modeled NPCs with dozens of different animation rigs for the different body shapes and sizes. Nor is there anything stopping them from making an open world that truncates an entire American state with multiple major cities in it. It's all a matter of how many hands you have on deck and how long you can continue to pay them. GTA is a series that attempts to approximate modern-day reality, and that's an insane task to achieve convincingly since we all know what that looks and feels like. And conversely, it's probably why the only developer attempting to do it at this scale also happens to be in a class of one. In terms of story, a Bonnie and Clyde crime romance was not on my wish list for a GTA story, but after Red Dead 2 told literally one of the best stories ever, I'm willing to trust them. The scale of this story seems a lot smaller and more grounded than 5's, which is good, and having a female protagonist is inherently interesting for the series if you ask me. It opens up a completely unexplored perspective in a series that has not been particularly hospitable for the women that are in it, which should provide for a fresh character and maybe even mission design as well. I think it's also nice that she stars alongside a male protagonist, because that means two completely different customization options for things like hairstyles and clothes have to exist, which is always a fun aspect of Rockstar games. Far more interesting to me than Lucia and Jason's story is the direction they're taking with portraying not just the setting of Florida, but contemporary American culture as a whole. The bulk of this trailer appears to be in-world social media clips from a TikTok-like app that are likely doled out to the player as the story progresses via an in-game phone UI. The way they've done this is in such contrast to GTA V's South Park parody style. Here, it's almost so deadpan and true to life, or at least its extreme aspects, that I've seen many people online take it as an endorsement, or at least not the critique that it so obviously is being a GTA game. I know they did London once, but GTA has become all about the US and satirizing it. They've picked up on such specific little things that you see happening in the modern experience. Takeover events in the middle of intersections, roving bands of dirt bikers illegally riding them on the streets, and of course, the woman twerking on the moving car. And then there's all the more distinctly Floridian bits of culture that make an appearance, such as the cop pulling the gator out of the pool, or the guy grabbing his crotch in an act of road rage. When you're dealing with subject matter like this, it's easy to come off cheesy, it can come off too judgmental, and with a GTA game, you need to be edgy, but you can't go too obscure or deep. People have to easily recognize where it's from and get it. What they've landed on here walks this perfectly fine line of being simultaneously comical and ridiculous, yet also deadpan and kind of bleak. It's legitimately the most impressive part of the entire thing for me, and I feel that people are really overlooking just how genius it is. Having a story that's likely more serious and down-to-earth, set with this almost depressingly cartoonish portrayal of modern America as the backdrop, is the perfect pairing, I think. And hopefully that portrayal doesn't feel outdated by the time the game comes out. I just came away from this trailer feeling such a high level of trust. A lot of key people have left Rockstar since GTA 5, and there was that report last year talking about how much the culture had shifted. There was a small part of me that was braced for, maybe not disappointment per se, but for something to feel off. While what they're doing here is in many ways quite different from 5, those fears are allayed, and this mere 90-second teaser has immediately put this at the top of my most anticipated games. There are some issues though, well, more of a bitter aftertaste if anything, and the first one came right at the end of the trailer, and that's the 2025 release window. That's further away than expected. Rockstar usually does a year-long pre-release cycle, and while it might feel like they had their hand forced and went a little early with this, I think it's very intentional for two reasons. First off, it pretty much guarantees that this game won't be delayed. It's almost as if they kind of built in a big buffer here by just stating a year. And it also allows more time for PS5 and Xbox Series consoles to saturate households. We're already deep into the generation at this point, but it doesn't feel like it because we've seen unprecedented support for the previous generation systems. And for a lot of people who spend the majority of their time on more mainstream releases like COD or Fortnite, there's honestly not that much reason to upgrade. It also doesn't help that we've been living through economically dire circumstances, and specifically outside of the US, console prices haven't been going down, they've actually been going up. By the time this game comes out, which is almost certainly going to be fall of 2025, we'll be 5 years deep into the generation, which is scary to think about, but ensures a larger potential customer base. More disappointing, however, is that there will be no PC version at launch. It's both surprising and not. PC is such a priority these days, and we see it get releases that would have been unthinkable just 5 years ago, but Rockstar is apparently sticking with their tradition of delayed PC launches, which is honestly a massive bummer for me, as this is definitely a 30 FPS game on the consoles. Nonetheless, I was seriously impressed by this brief trailer, and I think just about everyone else was too, which is really quite an accomplishment when expectations have had a decade to run wild in all our collective heads. Jeff Keighley's Game Awards have always been an exercise in patience for me, and while this year's wasn't as bad as it usually is, I still continue to question if this format and tone, emulating a Hollywood awards show and combining it with E3-style reveals, is a good idea. I could care less what the industry people who vote on these believe to be a deserving game, but clearly the awards part of this show was not the priority this year, with the winners being played off the stage seconds into their speeches, and Hollywood celebrity guests soaking up a disproportionate amount of the stage time. If you're going to do an awards show, you should probably just do an awards show, leave all the E3 drops out of it, and at most include some homages, like the musical performances, which were actually pretty good this year and game-related. Again, I have no interest in that stuff, I only watch these for the E3 drops, but if you're going to do Game Awards, the priority should probably be on Game Awards. Anyway, there were some smaller announcements here that caught my eye, like the God of War Ragnarok DLC Valhalla, which came out of nowhere and was also available free of charge shortly after. I assumed it was going to be some kind of horde mode like what The Last of Us 2 Remastered is doing with its no return mode, but apparently it actually advances the story and includes new and compelling content, which is really cool. Then there was a compilation announcement from Sega of 5 different games from their IP back catalog, though it remains unclear if these are remakes, reboots, sequels, or some combination of the 3. It's really cool to see Jet Set Radio make a return, and I personally love Crazy Taxi, but I'm not sure I loved what little I saw. I feel like the art styles of all of these have this kind of undesirable generic look that reminds me of the GTA Trilogy remaster, and I'm not sure if I have all that much faith in Sega to go 5 for 5 with these. Or even like 2 for 5, to be honest. Regardless, definitely a standout announcement from the event. Then there was the reveal of a Marvel Blade game made by Arcane. This really comes out of nowhere, honestly, and even stranger is the premise of the game. It's set in Paris, which I guess is just because Arcane is French and wanted to do that. Much more of a shakeup, though, is the format of the game, which is said to be third-person action. If I'm not mistaken, these guys have only ever done first-person games, and before they mentioned that this would be third-person, I just had this mental image of a Dishonored-like game where you play as Blade, which would make sense and work, but they're really shaking things up this time, which is maybe the right move. Outside of the disastrous Redfall made by the Austin studio, Arcane's games are almost always praised, but they've just never clicked with me. I don't like Dishonored at all, and Deathloop is very similar in its playstyle. I respect that they attempted to tackle the immersive sim genre with Prey, but I just couldn't get down with that game and its lifeless energy and plodding pace. So coming off of these first-person, more methodical, slower-paced games, Blade could really be a good shakeup, while still incorporating aspects of their previous games that people love, such as stealth and intricate level design. The trailer oddly makes no mention of platform, but with them being owned by Microsoft and Redfall proudly, or perhaps shamefully, being an Xbox exclusive, Blade likely will be as well. The biggest news, though, by far was the official unveiling of Kojima's Xbox game. This is his long-rumored horror project, which actually had a clip leak last year, though that seems to have flown under the radar somehow. It's called OD, but in the leak it was called Overdose, which could still be the title, seeing as how they're referring to Death Stranding 2 as DS2. Since Kojima Productions' involvement with Xbox Game Studios was officially announced last year, we've known only 2 things about the project. Firstly, it's obviously an Xbox exclusive, and secondly, it was specifically mentioned that the cloud would be used in some unique way. After this reveal, we know only a little bit more. Most notably, director Jordan Peele is collaborating with Kojima on the project, which echoes Guillermo del Toro's involvement with the infamously cancelled Silent Hills. The trailer itself reveals almost nothing. It's just facial renders that are clearly generated from a motion capture studio, but the references to Silent Hill and PT go deeper than a horror director being associated with the project. First off, the door that Kojima walked through on stage is basically one-to-one the PT door, and then some people noticed in the trailer itself written on this actor's tongue is Atami, a reference to Silent Hill. I always thought Death Stranding utilized most of the ideas Kojima had for Silent Hills, given they both share Norman Reedus as the protagonist and how quickly Death Stranding materialized after the tumultuous Konami split. With such obvious references, maybe that's not the case though. Regardless, it's going to be interesting to see Kojima's take on a pure horror game. I think the most interesting thing about this game so far is that it's using Unreal Engine 5. Death Stranding and Death Stranding 2 use Guerrilla's Decima engine, which they both collaborate on. However, Guerrilla is a Sony studio, and that connection was forged by nature of Kojima Productions initially aligning with Sony. I don't know the nature of their contract for using the Decima engine, but clearly putting it on Xbox is a bridge too far. So, while I'm disappointed to see their extremely capable semi-in-house engine shelved for this project in favor of the stubbornly ubiquitous Unreal Engine, I guess it was kind of a necessity here, but it remains to be seen how the studio will handle swapping over to another engine whilst simultaneously continuing to use Decima for DS2. The ever-nebulous Cloud is still being prominently mentioned as one of the only confirmed details about the game, and that combined with the language about this being a new form of media, the trailer's focus on meta-human rendering, the fact that it's a secondary project with a different engine, and now the involvement from a film director gives me the impression that when we do learn more, it'll end up being maybe a smaller release or less of a game and more of an interactive film rendered in real time, like a Quantic Dream or Until Dawn style thing. Either way, not the typical AAA game you might expect. It might sound like I'm down on this, but I'm not. It's easily the most exciting thing from this event. This is actually the kind of direction I hoped Kojima would go in, rather than establishing a new franchise and a bunch of sequels. The independent nature of his studio and his legend status in the industry give him an artistic and financial blank check to experiment as much as he'd like, and I always hoped that that would result in smaller, stranger, one-off titles, and I think that's what OD is. Kojima has gone with Hollywood actors again, but his picks this time are even more interesting than Death Stranding's cast, and Jordan Peele has made two very solid horror films, and will hopefully bring a Western and more conventional sensibility to work in contrast with Kojima's more avant-garde Japanese flavor. If you ask me, PT is the scariest game ever made, and it's like a 30-minute long, barely interactive demo, so I'll be watching OD with great interest. This was a small but surprising piece of news that didn't make massive headlines, but I feel is an overall indicator of what's been going on not just at Naughty Dog, but Sony as a whole, and it's really not good. Way back in 2019, it was announced that what was supposed to be a simple multiplayer component that shipped alongside The Last of Us Part 2, in the tradition of what had been done with The Last of Us 1 and Uncharted 2 through 4, had morphed into a project that was larger in ambition and would become its own standalone product. The Last of Us 2 shipped, and as the years passed, we really got nothing regarding the status or direction of the project, other than some concept art and statements that it was still in development. Then came the news earlier this year that Sony had Bungie audit the game, and they found it to be severely lacking. But we were assured that the game would still see the light of day. Well, here we are now months later, and the project is officially dead. I think anyone could have guessed that this game was in development hell, but it's shocking to see Sony's most prestigious studio struggling like this. Since The Last of Us Part 2 in 2020, we haven't heard or seen anything out of them other than The Last of Us Part 1, which, from what I understand, wasn't even a fully internal effort, this now dead multiplayer project, and the soon-to-be released Part 2 remastered, which was met with a collective groan from the general public when it was inadvertently announced via a PlayStation Store leak not too long ago. In their brief PR statement, they say they came to the decision to cancel it because the nature of a live service game would continuously pull resources away from their single-player projects, which is what they feel is important to them. Of course, the immediate thought is that this is a huge setback for the studio and a lot of wasted work, which sucks. But I think the most disheartening thing about this is that it doesn't seem like at any point constraining this project down to be more like the original Last of Us multiplayer was ever on the table. It had to be a full-on live service game with a battle pass and constantly evolve over seasons. Even if it came out and was good, I don't think Factions would ever have had enough of a player base to justify being that kind of game. The Last of Us IP is strong, but it's strong for its storytelling, and while I loved the first game's multiplayer, most people didn't touch it, and its hardcore Gears of War-like style is just not what thrives in the mainstream, especially now. Of course, the monetary allure of making the next Fortnite is strong, I understand it, and now that Microsoft is going to have Call of Duty, Sony is rightfully scared and feeling that they are lacking in this area and consequently have been making a lot of bets lately, but none of them seem poised to take off. And I guess the scary part is, if Sony's crown jewel studio is suffering like this and being allowed to struggle for as long as they did with this project, what does that say about the overall direction of PlayStation Studios? Bungie are apparently already having severe issues internally before they've even been fully integrated into PlayStation Studios, and their recently announced Marathon reboot is yet another one of these live service games. This all comes at a time where Sony and the PlayStation brand is starting to lose some of its charm, and as I mentioned in my last State of Play video, it feels like we're quickly entering a bit of a dry spell for PS5 exclusives, with only FF7 Remake Part 2, Death Stranding 2, and Wolverine on the horizon. Sony is so badly lacking in B-tier and smaller releases right now, and as the development cycles for the tentpole games get longer and longer, that's really hurting them, I feel. Certainly the last thing they need is to waste precious resources on live service attempts that are dead on arrival or don't even get out the door. Xbox is obviously doing awful right now, but even they had a game earlier this year, Hi-Fi Rush, that feels like the kind of win that used to be a PlayStation thing, something like Gravity Rush 2 on the PS4. Sony's success with its big-budget, narrative-driven single-player titles is an anomaly in the market right now, so I don't understand why they don't see the value in traditional or old-school multiplayer packages, which I think is a much better fit for both the PlayStation brand and their studios. For example, Bungie's Marathon reboot. I mentioned that could have been an opportunity to do a traditional package like Halo with a campaign and a more static multiplayer suite. Games like that, along with smaller and more niche titles, are what they need right now. I say, instead of forcing these studios to make the next Fortnite in vain, let them have a second, smaller project going on, a place where the stakes are a bit lower, the development time is at least halved, and they can experiment a bit, maybe a $40 game. It gives them a safe testing space outside of their AAA games, and unlike these live service attempts, if you get it wrong, you're not left with nothing to show for and negative profit, and if you get it right, you have a cult hit on your hands for very little development cost. Well, at least that's what I think makes sense. Lots of interesting topics here. If you guys have your own thoughts, feel free to let me know. Until next time, thanks for watching.